So we should be live now. Evening, everyone. Welcome back to DMC TV. Got another guest for an interview tonight, which is David McHutchon. I think I've pronounced that properly, David, speaking Austrian, who is the leader of Sovereignty, a Scottish political party. It's a small party. From my research, so sorry, I can hear myself in the background there. A couple of the core principles of the party that he wants independence from Britain, but also the European Union. Got the man himself here tonight to tell us about the party, who they are, how they differ from the SNP, what went wrong with the 2014 referendum. Is there a new referendum on the horizon? If so, how would that go? Going to talk about the party's views on a couple of geopolitical issues with the Middle East conflict and the impact of that on the Eurovision Song Contest and how Israel's place in the world could be viewed in the outcome of that, and also the party's stance on immigration. So, David, without further ado, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's usually you as the host that would do this, but I understand that you're on 199 subscribers. So allow me, for anyone that's listening, if you would like the honor of being a subscriber number 1,000, I think you have maybe a few seconds or minutes at most to nail that particular one. Yeah, so thank you. It's an honor. I really appreciate it. And yeah, so we're used to getting invitations to speak from Scottish shows, but maybe less so from down south. But yeah, it's a real pleasure, and hopefully I can do a little bit to just explain the background behind Sovereignty. So we, as you correctly point out, we're a double-out party. We would like Scotland to regain her independence, but regaining our independence, contrary to the SNP view, means staying out of the European Union. And we have put both of those principles in the constitution of our party. They're absolutely fundamental to what we're about. Fundamentally, we believe in a system of nation states, but at the heart of nation state is a nation, and it's our view that the Scottish people are a nation, and hence, and I think that really lies at the heart of our case for independence. That being said, it's absolutely patently clear that Scotland's most important bilateral relationship following independence is going to be with England or the rest of the United Kingdom, wherever it would be. Certainly, we would desire that however independence is achieved, it's done in an amicable spirit. That it's done with acknowledgement that over the course of the past several hundred years, many families, my own included, have folk on either side of the border. There really is no cause for acrimony. And I think particularly when you have an aggressive and expansive European Union, following independence, it would actually be important for Scotland and England, Wales, Northern Ireland, hopefully we'll be leaving the European Union at some point, but for us to certainly, to some extent, in international relations, have each other's backs. But all of that being said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the state the United Kingdom is in at the moment. We're witnessing a huge breakdown in social cohesion. I think there's enormous difficulties in the UK with its complete and total inability to control its own borders. It's got a very permissive immigration. It has had very permissive immigration policies since 1999, since Tony Blair's Immigration and Citizenship Act was passed. I've seen under the so-called Conservatives absolutely record levels of immigration that has been largely uncontrolled, but also we've seen very, very large amounts of legal migration as well, with very little thought or effort given to social cohesion and how you actually hold a country together. At the same time, the United Kingdom has become one of the most socially liberal countries on the planet. I think probably the strongest evidence for that is NC1, the recent amendment to, I believe it was Stella Creasy's bill, going through the Houses of Parliament, where MPs voted, I would say it was roughly 3-1 in favour of an amendment that would legalise abortion up to birth, which is just, it's just an unthinkable law. Anyone that has held a newborn, particularly a premature newborn, and will maybe have a sense of the gravity of what that means to take the life of an infant in that manner, in any manner. But I think it's extraordinary. And even the so-called forces for reaction in the country, folks like Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe, both with massive followings online, neither bothered to vote against this legislation. Both of them abstained on or were absent for one of the most significant votes in recent UK parliamentary history. So certainly UK is in, I think, at a point of deep crisis. Many other crises that we see, financial, certainly being one of them. UK is completely incapable of balancing budget, it would seem. It's deindustrialized massively from Thatcher's era onwards, and that's particularly affected Scotland. We also see in Scotland the impact constantly of particularly regressive land laws, and you see, for instance, the way in which huge amount of Scottish land, Scottish industry, our whisky distilleries, our fisheries, and so on, are essentially controlled from overseas. And the Highland clearances have never been reversed. There are historic injustices like that we would like to see taken care of. So certainly, I think there is a case that could be made that the UK is a failed state. If not a failed state, it's very close to being one. And on the flip side of that, and perhaps an acknowledgement of it, you see an increasing authoritarianism, illiberalism coming from recent UK governments. You saw that in a major way during coronavirus. I don't think the UK was particularly unique in a global context with that, but it certainly wasn't one of the more liberal countries. But you also see, you have seen, I think, for the past 20, 30 years, the UK really lead the way in terms of the surveillance society. The number of, and listen, I'm not saying this is all from the state, right? Ordinary people have a lot to answer for as well. We all carry one of these devices, okay? We're all creating vast amount of data about our life and voluntarily handing it over to whoever. But the UK was absolutely forefront in the 90s and early noughties in pushing forward the surveillance state, the surveillance society. And you still see that, digital ID is the latest thing. It's going to be massive. You're seeing the push for CBDCs. So I think there's, when you take it all together, I'm an ex-unionist. I come very much from a unionist family, a family where we all love the UK, love the flag, etc. And so certainly that would be where I was in my late teens and early 20s. But there's been a real reality check. I don't even know at this point that I think it could be very hard to make the case even that the UK deserves to continue. And okay, so there's going to be the reform wave at the next election. I think that seems to be pretty much nailed on. I think the real telling point will be if the sort of changes that a lot of ordinary working folk in particular are looking to see, when they don't happen, then I think the next wave is going to be English nationalism. And I think it may very well be English nationalism that ends up being the nail in the coffin of the United Kingdom. So you could very well see, that rear its head. There are already active English nationalist parties like the English Democrats, the English Constitution Party, but you already are seeing, I think, a real noticeable uptick in English nationalist sentiment. I absolutely get it for a lot of folk who have a deep emotional attachment to the UK. I know from my earlier life what that feels like. There will be a sense of loss and trepidation accompanying that, but I don't. Our pitch, my pitch, certainly, sorry, I would be fairer to say it my pitch, because this is very much my personal view on it. I think the UK has lost the moral right to expect to continue. So, not maybe the happy, shining, positive, optimistic beginning that you would like, but that's
what you call an answer. I wasn't sure if you're going to go for 60 minutes there without me speaking. But no, David, you've raised a lot of various points there, some interesting ones. I guess what I would say is that, let's say in a hypothetical world that Scotland gets independence, to me, unless I'm naive, ignorant, whatever you want to call it, Scotland, I would consider the average vote as more liberal than the rest of the UK. So you've talked about abortion. I completely agree. I'm against abortion at any time, but up to birth basically is satanic, disgusting. You've talked about immigration. Again, I'd say the average English voter is more anti-immigration compared to the average Scot. You had Humza Yousaf, leader of the SNP, who did that famous speech where he said there's too many white people in powers of influence in Scotland. So what makes you think that if Scotland did get independence, things on a social, moral basis would actually improve?
I think there's several points to this. I think in general, what follows collapse is often a bit of a turn to one's roots, and I think you see that quite. I'm not saying necessarily Scottish independence would go this way, but I do think you see that to a large extent with something, say, for instance, like the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, or when the Iron Curtain came down and you saw the dispersal of the Soviet bloc, I don't think many folk would have contemplated at that point, particularly seeing some of these states from Eastern Europe as they're starting to turn westward, looking westward, that it would have led to, a big uptick. And you see this in countries like Poland and Romania, big uptick in religiosity, church attendance, that you would see, the strengthening of conservatism. I mean, those independence movements were led by movements largely from the left, like Solidarność. And I don't necessarily say that to say, okay, yes, Scotland necessarily is going to be more conservative following independence. But I certainly don't think it's a case that can be ruled out. In terms of your use of the word liberal, I'm not actually sure that I agree. I think it's certainly true to say that Scots are more left, and we have a far stronger history of socialism in action. There's often been quite a strong strand of socially conservative but economically left thought in Scottish life. Figures like George Galloway would be a really good example. You can't think of a more left-wing figure today in British politics, right? He leads the Workers' Party of GB, that is, communist symbolism. But who was more outspoken than George Galloway about the abortion vote, for instance? Here's a socially conservative Scottish Catholic who's, absolutely outraged at it. And almost seemed to flip him on the UK, because he has been very, very outspoken as a unionist. But I think actually that's changing. And there are certainly other left-wing figures in a Scottish context that are like that have a more socially conservative outlook. And yeah, in terms of things like, you mentioned Humza Yousaf. Okay, I mean, Humza Yousaf wasn't voted in by the Scottish people. If my memory serves me correct, it was the SNP insiders that chose him as their leader.
I think it was the membership. Yeah.
Yeah, and even that vote, I mean, if you were following at the time, questions were raised about it. I'm not going to say more than that. The questions were raised about the legitimacy of that vote because of Kate Forbes' access to data, I believe it was. I would need to go back and look at all the comments from the team, but there are definitely
not aware of that. Yeah.
Humza Yousaf's popularity was pretty slim, actually, in a Scottish context. He enjoyed institutional support, but he enjoyed institutional support often from institutions that basically are operating in a union context. There's not this big groundswell of Yousaf fandom from ordinary Scots. So I think things are not entirely as they seem. I think Scots traditionally have had the Kirk has had a very, very strong role in Scottish life. It was considered the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland was considered almost like a proxy for a parliament for many years of Scottish history. The Scottish Reformation, when it happened, I think they said about it, was nowhere was the Reformation more thoroughly carried out than in Scotland. And, in every village in Scotland, you'll still find, not always, sadly, operating, but you'll find a church. And I think that until recent times has really translated into higher levels of church attendance and other markers of religiosity. So I think it's far from inevitable to say, yes, there are some recent trends in Scotland where you can say, all right, it looks like Scotland's taking a slightly more liberal tack. There are others, like remember the abortion vote only applies to England and Wales. My understanding in Scotland is that it's still 24 weeks. So there are other areas in which Scotland, I think, is really, there has been pushback from more socially conservative voices. All that being said, I think that there is a general trend across the West. What we're seeing, we're seeing social trends that are taking place simultaneously in multiple countries. And as a general rule, I would say that it's better for countries to maximize their power, the sovereignty at the level of the nation state, and give as little power as possible to global organizations, whether they be the UN, UNICEF, WHO, the European Union. A lot of the sort of trends that I'm sure we would both have huge issue with are coming from that level. So having a renewed state rooted in a particular people with a particular history and a particular culture, I really think that is the way forward in the context of aggressive globalization, but couple it together with important, useful alliances between peoples. And there are organizations that are seeking to do that, particularly across the West. The West has been in the vanguard of leading this sort of institutionalized permissiveness. The West also has been the source of the earliest and the strongest resistance against it. So we're happy to be doing our small part within the context of the Scottish independence movement to push back against that, to push back against globalism. We're not afraid to work with other parties elsewhere in the UK if it serves those interests, serves the interest of pushback against globalism. I'll give an example of that. We're a signatory of the Belmont Accord, which is an accord that was signed by the Alliance for Democracy and Freedom, the English Democrats, the Populist Party, the Freedom Alliance, and Putting Crew First. And we do think that there can be these sort of fora for common cause against globalism. But ultimately, for us, the British state seems to be like the uber globalist power. It's often when you're looking at some of these globalist initiatives and where was it coming from? How did it end up in the UN? And you find that there's American money and British money behind it. And so, can the UK survive? That's an open question.
So, I've seen on your website that your party is going to take part in elections next year. Excuse me. Just in one word, do you plan to take part in elections in 2029 at the next general election as well?
Well, we would quite like for there not to be a United Kingdom by 2029, but if there is, were that to be the case, I'm sure we would, yes.
So my question to you is, you'd obviously be pitting up against the SNP in those elections and splitting the pro-independence vote. Could it not be argued that the SNP's success, even though they want to rejoin the EU, they've probably got a vast array of policies you don't agree with, they could be used as a stepping stone to first deal with the Scottish independence argument, and then afterwards you could redouble your efforts to try and get independence from the EU or change Scotland into your vision, if you see what I mean?
Just briefly, the SNP have had numerous mandates in the past to push independence forward. They appear to have no plan, there's no action from them on independence. I mean, you could say Alex Salmond had, I think, a pretty decent plan with Indy Ref 1 in 2014. It fell short in the popular vote. But considering where that campaign was starting from, you can't really be faulted for the effort and the impact it had in the national conversation around independence. I think Nicola Sturgeon had some very bad plans, like trying to go cap in hand to the UK Supreme Court, asking for independence. Swinney, the current leadership, appear to have no plan, and it's creating, I think, a real democratic deficit for Scots who would like to see action on independence. And so we are actually going into the Scottish Parliament elections. We're going to ally or will be in alliance with two other pro-independence parties, ISP, and a group of independents for independence. And we already have, I'm not sure of the exact numbers. We're recruiting candidates all the time, but there's 72 constituency, roughly 72, I think, last time. They're in the process of changing the boundaries, but we'll call it, for argument's sake, around 72 constituencies in the Scottish Parliament, leaving aside the regional seats. And we already have announced candidates for in the region of about a third of those. And we plan to get as close to 72 as we can. And we have some really outstanding candidates, some pretty well-known candidates within the independence movement. So we're confident that we can make a start and put pressure on the SNP, who are more interested in getting men into women's changing rooms than they are in winning independence for Scotland. And that is supposed to be the, as Ron Seale says, your Scottish National Party should do exactly what it says in the tin, and they don't. They're not interested in independence. What they do every time an election is coming up, because they know the independence movement will come out and back them, is, I think what they'll do is they'll all of a sudden, just before an election, start talking about independence in every speech and every press release. So, but it's a tired and well-worn trick. I think the movement is fair scunnered, as we say in Scotland, with that, and we would be very strongly of the view that the only way that you can get action on independence is by putting forward an alternative vehicle, an alternative group of people who are going to actually push it forward. So,
okay. So, David, what went, and from your point of view, what went wrong in the 2014 referendum, where independence got 45% of the vote roughly, compared to 55% to stay? What went wrong, and if there was a referendum held tomorrow next year, do you think the result would be different, and why?
Okay, so I'm reluctant to be too critical because, as I mentioned, yes was starting from a fairly low. If you look at the opinion polls going into the referendum, they were showing yes to be in the low 30s. By the end of the campaign, it was at 45, and that was after an extensive national discussion. That was a lot of people changing their mind on independence over the course of that campaign. In terms of very specific mistakes that were made, I think the biggest one was the currency. So Salmon didn't seem to. I think Salmon's approach with it, the late Alex Salmon's approach with it was you need to try and create as few barriers as possible. But the question of sterlingization as a policy was one that I think was very, very ill thought through. So the policy that an independent Scotland should have is to have its own currency, a Scottish currency. Now, I've traveled throughout post-colonial Africa, Central Asia, Asia. You'll find hundreds of states that have managed, following independence, to establish their own currency. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, there are issues you've got to sort out. What about contracts that were concluded prior to independence in one currency and so on and so forth? But this is not beyond the gift of man to sort this. And so having financial sovereignty, having monetary sovereignty is a major part of sovereignty overall. So I think it would be really important for an independent Scotland, as Iceland does, which is a far smaller economy, a smaller country, smaller population. I think it would be really, really important for us just to say, we're going to commit to a Scottish currency, no sterling, no euro. This is an essential part we consider of our national sovereignty. And that decision, unfortunately, was kind of hashed, but it's easy with the benefit of hindsight to criticize. I think there was also, I will say, from the unionist side, there were certain very important interventions towards the end, that, even Gordon Brown's, I think, that certainly helped sort of shift the conversation that were considered to be quite influential. In terms of what's changing, I would say the major thing is, despite the incredible unpopularity of the SNP, SNP polling roughly about in the 30s percent wise, support for independence is now consistently coming in at over 50% in opinion polls. So this is an opinion that people, what's happened, this opinion that people are coming to of their own accord. It's not because they see SNP and the SNP government as kind of a proxy for what government would look like in an independent Scotland. There's a range of other factors that are leading people to say, something, I think we would be better off regaining our independence, re-establishing Scottish statehood, and doing things our own way.
So is there an issue with leadership with Scottish nationalists? Because Alex Salmon and Nicola Sturgeon, I would consider household names, but back in the day. But I don't really think that's the case now. Has the issue of Scottish independence, maybe speaking from England, it just doesn't seem to be at the forefront or on the agenda at all?
Yeah, you're probably right. I think I think there should be more leadership. That's from and I say this as one of the people who should be maybe more prominent and speaking out more, seeking more platforms to make the case. I think you probably have struck upon something. I'll be sure to share that right. But I think what I would say is, there is also a change underway, and I think this is something that people are really, taking a while to adjust to. the leader of the Scottish National Party was de facto the leader of the Scottish independence movement and has been for decades. Scottish National Party goes back to the 1930s. It's not. It's
Oh, really? Okay.
It's the centrality to the movement can't be understated. So what you have developing, yes, certainly you had really outstanding leadership under Alex Salmond, whatever his faults, and I really strongly disagree with him on the, would have disagreed with him on the European Union. But whatever his faults, he was a strong leader. And I think in his wake, I think that hasn't really, there hasn't really been the figure that has been needed to step up to the plate to take on that mantle and push it forward. But what I would say is in the grassroots, there are really strong, outspoken figures. We're just in a Liberate Scotland context. You have folks like Roddy McLeod, Eva Comrie, Colette Walker, who are all passionate advocates for Scottish independence. You have figures that are, I would say, kind of more like dissident SNP, folks like Jim Sillars, who are very much, outspoken and command a huge amount of respect within the movement. You have the birth of new media, like new Scottish pro-independence media that is becoming more prominent. So there is a change. I think you also have, some leadership from the left, maybe more outspoken leadership from the left in people like Craig Murray and Tommy Robinson. But there is also a need. So I think we're going through a bit of a transition period. I think the days of the SNP being the single vehicle that was going to drive Scotland to its independence have passed. And honestly, it's a little bit like, the way that UKIP and the Conservatives, for instance, used to interact. When you have smaller parties that are coming through, they're putting pressure, they're maybe taking a more hard line on independence and calling for action on it. What it will do, or what it should do, is put pressure on the larger, more mainstream party. And they know if they do not follow through, if they abandon their core principle, what they've basically been put there for, then there's going to be a changing of the guard. And that's what you're seeing at the moment in a UK context with the Conservatives and Reform. I called it, I think it was in May last year, and I hadn't heard anyone else make this call, but when I saw the started to really dive into the figures about levels of illegal and legal migration under the Conservatives, at some point in the earlier part of last year, and I put this out online, I made the claim that the Conservatives were finished, like actually finished, like not going to go through a rough patch. And it's so interesting that everything that we've seen in the past year and a half seems to be backing up that claim. Yeah. It'll be the same story for the Scottish National Party. You disillusion your core voters too many times. Eventually, one time they'll say, "No, we've had enough. This is not what we're putting you there for," and there is no way back from that. And that's how parties go extinct. That's how they acquire dinosaur status, if you want. So. And the Scottish National Party better be careful, because they're not too far away from that. And it's not enough just to rediscover the cause of independence in the immediate run up to an election, because voters have longer memories than that, and they should, and I believe they will, hold the SNP accountable.
So there might be a collapse in the same way that we've had with the Tories. I mean, I was quite surprised the Tories actually got over 100 seats, despite the big win they got in 2019, because possibly put myself in this category. I did vote for the Tories in 2019, but in 2024, there was just absolutely no chance that was ever going to happen due to various things, partially COVID, the response to it, immigration, crime. I mean, the list goes on. And they've made a mockery of their own base, the Tories. They've not been conservative for 14 years, essentially, and we're seeing the outcome of that now, 2010 to 2024, 14 years of power. So maybe the SNP are going that way one day. We'll have to wait and see. I imagine you'll be mixed feelings on that. You want them to die as a party, maybe, but not the independence aspect of it. So it'd be interesting to see if that does happen. David, thank you for that. Moving on to the third topic of the night. You've touched on it once or twice. I just want to know about your party's stance on immigration.
We will be shortly releasing to the membership a draft manifesto for the 2026 Scottish Parliament election. Now, the Scottish Parliament shouldn't or really have too much to do with migration, but it is trying to acquire a role for itself. And obviously, under the leadership of the SNP and the Scottish Greens, it's essentially pushing for a kind of more open borders type approach. So what I'm going to say here, I would really emphasize this, is my personal take on immigration. And I think certainly leading up to the next UK general election, I think if we get to that point, we will be certainly seeing a bit more about that. But I think the first thing to state is it's really important to separate immigration and citizenship. There are countries around the world, United Arab Emirates would be a good example, that allow vast numbers of workers from across the world to come, work, help build their skyscrapers. But you try getting Emirati citizenship, it's next to impossible. Okay, you have to actually be Emirati to have Emirati citizenship. And for a lot of our history, I think that would have just been seen as like common sense. And so I think it may very well be the case that you say for economic reasons that, you want to bring in guest workers, whatever, for a certain period of time. But I think it's really important that when you have students in and student visas and so on, that there cannot be a path to independence through that. So for me, the key two things, the key two mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion but permitting some form of migration leading to citizenship are through families, I think, first and foremost, because where you have a marriage between husband and wife, one of whom is a citizen of the country, a national of the country, then you actually have a mechanism for cultural assimilation. It's very likely that those kids growing up any kids that came from that marriage growing up in that country would view themselves predominantly as a national of that particular country. Another way in which you have migration without the lack of social cohesion that we see from UK migration policy is through migration from the diaspora. And it is particularly important in a Scottish context where many Scots were, because of economic hardship or the Highland clearances, they were forced to leave their homeland, settled predominantly across the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but other places in the world as well. And for those that have maintained very strong ties to Scotland, they have a strong sense of their Scottish heritage. It seems to me that in the context of an independent Scotland, you would want to provide a route for them to return back to their ancestral homeland. And I think that if you've managed over 50, 100, 200 years to maintain that strong cultural connection, when you return to Scotland, you're going to be returning with a huge head start in terms of integrating into Scottish society. Not that Scotland hasn't changed in all those years, but a huge head start in terms of the sort of forms of cultural understanding that would be needed to become to be a a member of that society. So in terms of work sort of citizenship through work programs or economic migration leading to citizenship or study programs leading to citizenship, I think they're all highly problematic. I don't think they should exist. I mean, I'll just be that blunt. And I think that another thing that I would say is I think it's absolutely imperative, if there was a collapse of the United Kingdom, that there not be an automatic grant of citizenship to anyone that just happened to be in your country at the point when, you know, a newly independent England or Scotland or Wales, whatever, was established. Because I think essentially we've got this like strong juxtaposition at the moment. You feel it in certain communities in particular, where there are places in the country where people are coming in, they're being accepted, they're integrating, they're wanting to adopt Scottish culture, customs, and so on, and that's fine. But there are also other parts of the country that are essentially single national, or there are just several nationalities that have ghettoized, chosen to ghettoize themselves, where all the relationships are being formed only amongst themselves, and where the cultural ties that exist are often far stronger to the homeland. And if that is the case, then, you know, I don't think there should be an automatic grant of citizenship. Now, it might be, for instance, that, you know, you don't, you say, okay, I'm not necessarily talking about, let me be clear, mass deportations, but I do think it is important that where someone's cultural allegiance, where their national allegiance is very far from clear, then it's absolutely acceptable for a country to say, okay, we may grant you residency, but citizenship is reserved for nationals of this country, whatever that country is. Those that we recognize as our own, those that have adopted the country and culture. You know, and you know, it's the Ruth test. I don't know how you are in the Old Testament, probably better than me. But I know that in the book of Ruth, isn't there that line about, you know, your people will be my people and your God will be my God, and wherever you go, I will go. It's one of the books of the Old Testament. And Ruth was a Moabitess that was essentially adopted into the Israeli people. It's a very interesting early picture of, you know, what successful cultural assimilation actually looks like. And even at the end of the book, she's still referred to as Ruth the Moabitess, you know. It kind of gives you an idea of like just how hard it is. But that was what was seen in those days as being necessary to integrate, you know. You become part of a family, you adopt the culture, you adopt the traditions, you drop the faith or the religion, you know, you fully do everything that it takes to assimilate into this new people. It can be done, but unfortunately, in a UK context, the process is viewed as entirely bureaucratic. It's formalistic, I guess you would want to say. And it's leading to really disastrous outcomes in terms of social cohesion. So,
did you see this? Did you see the story with the two girls? I think it was in Dundee a few weeks back.
Yeah.
With one of the girls had an axe and a knife. Is that? I know obviously that was quite well publicised on X and social media. Is that becoming more and more of a common thing in Scotland, where young girls are being targeted?
I want to be careful because my understanding is there is actually an ongoing criminal case against the.
You don't need to talk about that. Just
no. Yeah. I think first of all, let me just recap what it was in the public domain. So there was an incident where two young Scottish girls were approached by a gentleman, I believe it was even a couple, who were filming them and taunting them. And one of the things they were asking them to do was to pull out knives, or it was like a knife and an axe, small axe that the girl had behind her back. And they were seen in the video shouting things along the lines of "Stop beating up kids," or "You're beating kids." So this went viral, this went global, and everyone around the world was talking about it, apart from anyone in Scottish political life, which I thought was immediately quite odd. And so my reaction to it when it first came out was, what sort of a culture have we become where girls that age feel like they need to carry weapons to protect themselves? Not to exonerate, but just to ask the question, just to like push back. And at the same time, you had the Daily Mail essentially doing a puff piece on the couple who were on the other side of the camera who were filming them. And that couple have subsequently been charged. And that when they were charged by Police Scotland, very unusually, it wasn't made clear what they were charged with. So, and I asked that question as well online. Why is it that when Police Scotland released a statement about the girls, almost immediately they made it clear, what they were being charged with? And when it was the couple on the other side of the camera that had all this positive PR from the Daily Mail, there was no mention of the actual offence that they were charged with. So I'll leave it at that with regard to that specific incident, because presumably if they have been charged and arrested, there may well be further proceedings. So it's, I guess it's important not to prejudice anything like that. But yeah, in terms of becoming more common, I think there's definitely a sort of mood shift on the ground, in terms of the specific question of like self-defense. And if you went back 5, 10, 15 years ago, people would just have a sort of like sneering, condescending attitude towards the United States, and they're also mad because they've got like 1 million guns, and everyone's like what's it, looking after your own property as a DIY business and so on. But I would say that has, I'm not saying that this is a positive development. I think it's a sign that we've moved from being a high trust society to a low trust one. And we've never really had that same sense that they have in the States, that the Second Amendment, I believe it is a defense against tyranny, which is how it was always viewed. So that is always kind of in a Scottish, English, particularly UK context, been seen as a little bit unthinkable. But just for various different reasons, on the ground, there does seem to be a mood shift on this issue. So I don't know. I think a political class have got a lot to answer for. Why is it that people do feel unsafe? And if folk feel incredibly unsafe, then are we surprised really when there is this shift that people do feel they have to take matters into their own hands more? So yeah, I don't say any of this to justify anything that folk would do. Certainly never. I have no time at all for any form of vigilantism. I think that's out of line. All I would say is, we do have really, really serious problems that are always swept under the carpet, and it needs to change. It needs to change. People need to be able to talk openly about what's going on, and you need to have a political class that's willing to address issues. And if you have individuals that are a threat to communities, then get them out of there. If they're from overseas, send them home. If they're ours, lock them up. And we cannot have this situation where particularly our inner cities are allowed to become, parts of our inner cities are allowed to become no-go areas where people feel really, really unsafe, where there's almost no social cohesion. We can't have that. I mean, that's not the way we used to do things. Even go to places like Dundee, for instance. In the past there would have been grinding poverty, but your kids could play safely on the streets. Everyone was looking out for their neighbors, and I just don't think there's that same culture anymore. There's an awful lot of propaganda for we're welcoming cities and all this sort of nonsense, but it's not most people's reality, and I think that breakdown has to be addressed.
Thank you, David. Wise words there at the end. Should move on to the final topic of the night. Very different one. Is nice, easy one. The Middle East conflict.
How long have I got?
Yeah, 2,000 years maybe, or so, or 1948 onwards. Obviously, we've had the recent developments with people might laugh. Oh, why would we talking about Eurovision in this context, where a few countries such as Ireland and Spain have said if Israel are taking part, they're not taking part, like flat out blank, no ifs or buts. And the the Eurovision countries are all going to have a meeting to decide whether or not Israel takes part. So you could say on one hand, some people might say Israel's committing all these atrocities and they don't take part in Eurovision. Big what? On the other hand, it could be seen as a very big statement from what should be Israel's biggest supporters in countries like Britain and France, that they don't actually approve of what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So, David, my question to you is, in this context, is what's sovereignty's stance on the Middle East conflict, and do you believe Israel's committing genocide?
So, first of all, in the Eurovision, I'll put a question back to you before we begin. I mean, do you not just find it super hedonistic? I mean, do you?
Eurovision's got disgusting and way too sexualized over time. Absolutely. To my shame, I love it as a night of meeting up with friends and having a laugh. But particularly 2024 was, some of the songs were just vile. But it's been getting that way for years. It calmed down a bit. It calmed down a bit earlier this year. But yeah, that aside, I guess what the question's directing at is the sort of political implications of not allowing Israel to participate in the same way that they banned Russia a few years back.
Yeah. Well, I would agree. I mean, as a fervent Eurosceptic, my base for having anything to do with the Eurovision is pretty low, right? I mean, I just find that yeah, you're exactly right. It's you talk about objectification of women, of men, of that sort of level of sexualization.
It's got terrible, yeah.
And a lot of the music is of very, very questionable artistic merit. But hey, that's my personal taste, right? Okay, so we believe in free speech. I guess we believe in free songs. I'm going to knock yourself dead. But in terms of what Eurovision does with regards to Israel, I mean, so the Eurovision, I think, is under the control of the European Broadcasting Organization, Corporation Union. Sorry, that's the one. Which I believe, yes, Israel is a member of. Is that right? I would have to go away and look at that. So, I mean, if
just to jump in there, the interesting thing is that certain countries that don't actually take part in Eurovision will get a vote as well, and that does include some Arab countries like Morocco. Just to add that into the mix to make it even more interesting, whatever you want to call it. But sorry, carry on, Dave.
Yeah. So I'm not even sure this organization should exist, frankly. I mean, I certainly think it's ridiculous that we're sending any money to it. So if someone wants to organize something called the Eurovision Song Contest, go ahead, but do it privately. I mean, I don't think that's something that any state money from any of these countries should be going towards. And obviously, like, what's going on in Israel is, far more important than any sort of diplomatic sort of repercussions. So let me just try and kind of be straightforward about my view. So I believe the state of Israel is right to exist. I believe that the Jews have a legitimate and ancient link to that, to Israel as a land. I'm not of the view, as some are, that Palestinians are just like Arabs that have rebranded themselves. Obviously, they are viewed by all of their neighbors as, and Israel included, as a distinct people, and have the same right to a homeland, the same right to self-determination. I think it is interesting in the context of the UK's recognition of the state of Palestine that what the UK government seems to be recognising is the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and not Hamas. I think that's very important. I think Hamas clearly, if you look at the videos coming out of Gaza, and these are videos from Palestinians of justice being meted out by folk having their bones broken in the street with iron bars and all sorts of horrendous things. They act like a terrorist organization. I think they should be treated like a terrorist organization. So then you come to Israel's actions following the October 7th, and I mean, it's very, very hard not to look at the pictures of Gaza and the complete destruction of pretty much all significant residences, large parts of Gaza, and not think this is Israel is just going way above and beyond anything that would have been necessary in order to deal with Hamas, and specifically deal with this hostage situation. Remember, in Israeli history, there was a famous incident in Entebbe when a number of Israelis were taken hostage, and quite famously, the Israelis had this sort of very daring move where they flew into, I believe, the airport, and they were able to recapture all the hostages and bring them back with very little loss of life. And it was seen as a sort of like advert for a very sort of clinical and humane approach, but very, very effective approach to dealing with a situation like that. Whereas Gaza has just been more or less razed to the ground. There have been a very high number of civilian deaths. And I think the thing that particularly after the earlier stages of the campaign that really caught my attention was that it seems like Israel has a very, very high level of operational control over the battlefield, and not that Israelis haven't taken losses. So why then the level of destruction that we've seen? So yeah, it's one that I think is. So your second question was about genocide specifically.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? I'll put that back to you first.
Nice. It's a tricky one because in the context of what my understanding of genocide is, it's I don't have the Oxford definition in front of me. It's the elimination of a certain race, ethnicity. Israel could do that in theory if it wanted to, in quite a short space of time with its nuclear power, etc. I think at the same time, as you say, the destruction in Gaza is, I mean, the media aren't even allowed in, journalists aren't even allowed into Gaza. So what we see now is purely because of social media, and the destruction is just out of this world. And certain Israeli politicians do believe in a greater Israel where they want to expand Israel. I don't know if you saw the Louis Theroux documentary, where there are certain Israelis on the extreme side that just want to completely remove all Palestinians from Gaza and resettle it with Israelis. So could it be deemed ethnic cleansing in that sense? Yes, I think there is definitely an argument for that. We're near enough 2 years on from this conflict. God knows how much longer it's going to last. I think what Israel's done is way more than, I mean, October 7th was disgusting. And it's hard to say where's the line of what the response is, but they've definitely passed that.
Yeah. I think, and it's very hard. It's really interesting to hear you say this, because I feel like in online discussion of it, there's very few folk that are trying to look at the situation objectively, and it was mostly what we hear are the sort of like shills from the two extremes. So I think you're spot on. And I would say that, again, come back to this, right? The Palestinian Authority is the classic counterexample. Abbas and the PA have sought to maintain friendly and good relations with Israel, but at the same time, they're constantly having their territory shrunk. And, there's no attempt to say, okay, this is going to be the border, it'll be fixed and so on. But we're actually seeing settlers constantly moving into parts, into Muslim and Christian communities and in the West Bank, and encroaching on others' land. And it just looks like theft, honestly, So, and I think that there's, obviously it's part of the world with very high population density, but I just don't think that there is any sort of form of reward for the PA for their more constructive approach to relationship with the Israeli state, with the Jewish state, with the Israeli state. So, I think we're not in, by contrast, what happens to the Eurovision.
Irrelevant.
I feel like it was one way in which Russia was rewarded for the conflict in Ukraine. So
that's what I was saying at the start. People could look at that and think, who cares? In the same way, if Israel was perhaps banned from the World Cup and the Euros, Israel plays in the European qualifiers, even though it's in Asia. But it's not the punishment, or the image isn't the contest itself. It's the reason why they are actually being, is that the way they're seen by others. So when I was speaking to my mates about it, I would, one or two would be like, who cares? But it's deeper than that. And it'd be historic. It would be a big thing if they did get banned, because I don't believe they've ever been banned since they've entered the contest, basically.
Opinion polling, and there was something that went up on a really excellent broadcast website, called Wings Over Scotland. It's very important to the independence movement. It's that's sort of the new populist front of the independence movement. But Stuart Campbell put up a poll, and this, I don't remember the exact numbers, but directionally this would be correct, where those polled 15% supported Israel unequivocally, and 15% support Hamas, and you've got 70% in the middle who are kind of like a plague on both your houses. And they don't mean a plague on both the houses of the Israeli and Palestinian people. They mean on the governments and the leaderships. And actually that view is pretty common. I mean, just speaking to folk out and about in the streets, you'll hear that a lot. There's plenty blame to go around. But I think at this particular point, it's certainly the case that, I mean, Israel's response in Gaza has been grossly disproportionate. And yeah, And I think there's a real sort of like unwillingness by some that the Israelis would listen to call it out. Maybe that's happening privately, but not publicly. I think Trump is maybe the one figure that just comes out and says it. But I do think there has been a big shift. I mean, on the right as well. You see this definitely on the right in the US, where there would have been just block support for Israel. Very much on the left as well. But there you have figures like Tucker Carlson, you have figures like Candace Owens, maybe more radically, Megyn Kelly as well, who have maybe have started calling out Israel, and they're getting a lot of pushback over it. And most interestingly, perhaps Charlie Kirk, right, just before he died, was apparently he's a huge supporter of the state of Israel, but he had started to I think like privately express reservations about the approach of the Israeli government. And I think
of that.
Yeah. So so look, I think people just have to be objective. There's one moral standard for all of humanity. I really strongly believe that. It doesn't matter who you are. You don't get to commit ethnic cleansing. You don't get to disobey the laws of war. I'm not pointing. I think there can often be a disproportionate interest in Israel. Sometimes you have, I'll take Nigeria as an example, where huge numbers of Christians have been martyred over the past year or so, almost no attention to it. So I really just wish that we had like a consistent standard in discussing these things. It doesn't matter who you are, that you're held to the same standards. You have to protect basic human rights, basic human liberties. And I think that's a really good approach to take to international relations. Don't try and run other people's countries for them. I think that's really important. The doctrine of non-interference in the affairs of other countries, other sovereign states. I would never want to interfere in English politics. I'll leave that to the English. But I do genuinely think that we're kind of have lost a lot of these basic fundamental principles that are essential to the survival of the system of nation states. And let's be absolutely clear what the alternative is at this point to a well-functioning system of nation states. It's some form of global government. And of all the sort of the news cycle and the stories that you hear day in, day out, I would say that probably the greatest risk that humanity faces in terms of a threat to the international order is that we lose our belief in good boundaries making good neighbors. People being able to be self-governing, self-determining, and perhaps precipitated by some crisis, we start looking for strong men, even strong men operating at a global level. So I could see that coming, but we will see.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about Nigeria. With for those not aware, it's Boko Haram, a jihadi Islamist extremist group butchering Christians in their thousands.
Yeah.
If it was the other way around, if it was Christians killing Muslims, I'm sure the media would have a very different reaction. We'd be hearing about it every day. David, just brings us up to, over the hour mark now. Thank you very much for your time tonight. I'll do what I do with all my guests, give you a little outro, tell people where they can find you, and I'll put 1 or 2 links to your X and anything else under the comment section of this video.
Yeah, so for anyone who's, first of all, for anyone who's watching from Scotland and would like to get involved, to join us, there's some great opportunities at the moment with the forthcoming election to stand for the Scottish Parliament. So all of that can be found on our website, which is sovereignty.scot. So I'll say that again, sovereignty.scot. So if you go there, you'll find all of that. Now, also, we have our Twitter feed, which is Vote Sovereignty. So please feel free to follow us there. And you can see our podcasts on the Sovereignty Scot YouTube channel. So I'll send you all of those links. I would appreciate it if you share them. And we'll try and plug your show and keep up the excellent work. Thank you very much for the platform. Thank you for the opportunity to come on and spend time discussing our bonny wee country. So really appreciate it a lot.
No worries, David, and thank you very much for your time. I do have to apologise I missed all the comments. Well, it's only one person that's been commenting. Someone called Budgie Burger. I'm really sorry. I've missed about 10 or 15 of your comments because I had the comments hidden. So apologies for that. Thank you for the comments, and if you're here next time, I'll be sure to read one out. I don't know. I think David was alluding to at the start of the stream. I've been on 999 subscribers for a few days now. I don't know if anyone has subscribed during the stream. I'll check afterwards. But if you haven't, you enjoyed this and you want to see interviews with interesting guests and debates, please do give this stream a like and, more importantly, subscribe. Be really grateful. So, David, many thanks. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.